Hey, Mr. Usher here, doing a recorded lesson this time for my half credit class. So those are the classes meeting either during 5th period or 8th period. Basically this is going to be the lesson, as it indicates here, for May 10th and 11th. So that's going to be Tuesday, May 10th for the 8th credit class and Wednesday, May 11th for the 5th credit class. So if you're one of those two, you're in the right place. Otherwise, loose. Anyway, the topic, as it says here, is the psychology of religion. I misspelled it here. My apologies. There is both a din and a ticket out the door for this. We didn't quite fit everything in when we originally did this, so the last couple of parts had to be shoved into another lesson. But the din we definitely did, right? So I'm asking you to just, as it says here, reflect a bit on the importance or lack thereof of religion to you. Right? How important is religion to you and why? Right? So just think a little bit about that. So we gave out this questionnaire known as the Moral Foundations Questionnaire next. If we take a closer look at it, it's essentially trying to get at very basically where your sense of right and wrong comes from. So somebody does something and it seems to be like a good thing to do. You say, oh yeah, that's a good thing to do. That's right. Or somebody, probably more commonly, violates some kind of moral principle. They're like, no, that's messed up. That thing I did was wrong. How do you know it was wrong? Based on what purpose or instinct or thought or rationale? Where does it come from, right? As it says here on the questionnaire, when you decide whether something is right or wrong, to what extent are the following considerations relevant to your thinking, right? So they have things like whether or not someone suffered emotionally, whether or not someone cared for someone weak or vulnerable, whether or not someone did something disgusting, whether or not somebody showed a lack of loyalty, whether or not someone acted in a way that God would approve of, right? Because we're talking about religion today, right? So you rate, essentially, the degree to which you agree with this, 0 being not at all, 1 being not very relevant, 5 being extremely relevant, that kind of a thing. The next section here, kind of along similar lines, but they're talking more about sentences that you may or may not agree with, right? So things such as, when the government makes laws, the number one principle should be ensuring that everyone is treated fairly. Or people should be loyal to their family members, even when they have done wrong. Or chastity, which is refraining from sexual activity. Chastity is important and valuable as a virtue, right? Those kind of things. You add everything up, total them here, right? So you take your scores for these items, add them up, put them in the box, that kind of a thing. These two, in case you're curious, right? So items 6 and 22 are mostly attention checks, right? Oftentimes when we do a scale like this that has a lot of items, we include a few attention checks, which are basically items to make sure people are paying attention, right? If you kind of go to this one, like maybe just because you're feeling lazy, you're like, oh, I'm going to put 5 for everything, right? So you go through that, and then you get to 6, and it's like, yeah, it's really important to me when deciding right or wrong if somebody is good at math. That says to the researcher, like, okay, yeah, this person wasn't paying attention. Almost everybody would put a 0 for this, so. Because what does that have to do with right and wrong, right? You might be good at math, you might be bad. That doesn't mean you're a moral or immoral person. Anyway, so we did that one. I gave you some time to work on that. We discussed some of the results, what they mean. I also went over 6 moral foundations, right? This is based on Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, right? Basically, Jonathan Haidt, that's spelled H-A-I-D-T, he argued that we ultimately get our sense of right and wrong from a set of basic moral instincts that we evolved as a human species, right? So each of the 6 is referring to a particular kind of purpose that humans had in their early evolution. He actually originally started with 5 virtues, but he got some complaints from a political group called libertarians. And as a result, he added a 6th virtue, so 6 in total. Anyway, first one is care, with the bad thing being harm, right? So the idea is that, back up. So key thing in Jonathan Haidt's theory, key thing in Jonathan Haidt's theory is that we start with a moral instinct, right? This comes from kind of a biological or evolutionary point, and then we kind of build around that a rationale. Some kind of reasoning or thinking or logic that justifies this instinct we have. So we're not reasonable first, we're reasonable second, right? And of course, this also might conflict, since we're talking about religion, with your sense of where ethics or morals ultimately come from. Many people who are religious argue that morality comes from God, right? So if that's your belief, that's a belief you're entitled to. This is just Jonathan Haidt's theory, which he's backed up with evidence, right? It's a scientific theory because he's done studies and he's gathered evidence, that kind of a thing. But I just want to expose this to you. I'm not trying to challenge anybody's basic moral or religious beliefs. Those are something that I recognize as being very important to you, and I don't want to challenge that. Anyway, the 6 foundations. First one is care versus harm, right? Very basically, when we're evolving, we need to reproduce, right? The whole point of evolution is that we pass on kind of like the characteristics that have the best fitness to our offsprings, right? And to do that, we need to take care of our offsprings, right, when they're weak and vulnerable. So we get this general instinct to care for offsprings, and that gradually kind of spread as our brains developed to caring for people in general, right? So many people have a very strong sense of care for people who are weak, vulnerable, oppressed, something like that, right? They want to help them in whatever way they can, keep them from being harmed. So that's the first one. Second foundation is fairness versus inequality, basically. So fairness is basically like, stuff, right? Which is what we talked about when it came to justice and political psychology. Stuff should more or less be given to people in equal and fair amounts, right? Whatever you believe fairness or justice to ultimately be. So you shouldn't just randomly give one person more stuff or another person less stuff, that kind of a thing. And this kind of came from the fact that our early ancestors evolved in a very harsh environment where there were very limited resources, and you couldn't give every single person every single thing that they wanted or needed all the time. So the best thing you can do is maybe distribute them evenly, fairly, that kind of a thing. So we develop this inherent sense of fairness, right? We feel like there's a sense of moral outrage or immorality if somebody just clearly does something unfair, right? So that's fairness. It's the second one. The third one, excuse me here. The third one is loyalty, right? So to get things done on a larger scale, to kind of be safe and band together, we needed some kind of sense of society. Even if it was a relatively small group of 5, 10, 15 people, there was a sense of a group, right? And it became important to have loyalty to that group, right? To not betray that group, to do whatever you could to enhance the quality and the experience of the group. And so we started to judge it as being inherently immoral to go against the group, right? If you're kind of putting your own interest above the group, that's considered a bad thing, that kind of thing. So that's loyalty, right? Loyalty is the third one. Fourth one is authority. Authority, right? So as society's got even bigger, it became difficult to manage everybody, right? We can't always have everybody doing whatever they want because that would disrupt the sense of order. It would disrupt the sense of everybody kind of being cohesive and binding together. So we create rules, and to enforce those rules, we need some kind of authority. Somebody who's on top, who's telling people what to do, telling people what they can't do. And the authority, moral foundation, basically says, all other things being equal, listen to what the authority says, follow their rules, don't disobey them. To disobey them is wrong, right? To disrespect that authority is wrong. So that's the fourth kind of foundation, right? This is as opposed to kind of disrespect or like a flouting of the rules, that kind of a thing. Fifth one is purity, probably the hardest to understand, right? Which is why I kind of gave an example here with this video that I'm going to get to in a second. Essentially, purity started out initially as just rooted in our basic emotion of disgust, right? So why do we feel disgusted by things? Well, because they're gross, because they're ugly, because they're, sickening, right? Sickening maybe being a clear one, right? Basically, we developed a sense of disgust because we wanted to avoid being poisoned or infected by things. So our body would be like, ugh, if something could possibly infect us, right? And that's initially where this notion of purity came from, right? We wanted to keep things pure. We wanted pure water, pure food, pure air, that kind of a thing. We wanted to keep stuff that was impure away from it, right? So initially it was all about physical purity, but then eventually as our societies got bigger and bigger and bigger, that transferred into a sense of social purity, about people respecting certain things as being sacred and certain things as kind of being profane or earthly, right? We want to keep the sacred things above and away from this, and if you violate that by bringing the kind of profane things towards the sacred, right, you're doing a bad thing, right? So, for example, if I just had a bottle of water and I just dump it out, whatever. Maybe it's wasteful, but it's not inherently wrong. Maybe to just put water on the ground. But if I have a bottle of holy water, maybe you're a Christian or Catholic, you believe that priests can bless water and make it holy for the purposes of certain sacraments. If I have holy water, right, and I just casually dump that out, that's a bad thing, right? At least to a devoutly religious person, because it's not regular water. It's sacred in a certain way. It's been blessed. So we want to make sure we don't violate those things. That's what purity is about. It might be hard for some people to understand, but for many people, going against something that is inherently pure is in and of itself inherently immoral, right? Those are the first 5. The 6th one that was added is liberty. Liberty, like freedom, right? The idea with this one is that basically there was a mutation in society eventually. This is what Jonathan Haidt argues. He argues that, well, every so often there would be a weird mutation, a person who just did not want to go along with the group. Most people wanted to go along with the group, keep the society together, but then there were occasionally these people who were mutations who just wanted to do their own thing. And they're like, yeah, I don't care about that. Leave me alone, let me do my own thing, I'll leave you alone. There. And, that might seem like an inherent problem if you want to keep the group going and preserve humanity as a species. But Jonathan Haidt argued that by having these kind of dissenters, these people who, rebelled against the established norms occasionally, we kind of progress society, right? So if we didn't have these libertarians, these kind of people pushing the boundaries, slavery would still be widely accepted. Women wouldn't be able to vote. People of the same sex wouldn't be able to marry. So we need people to push those boundaries, otherwise society is going to stay stagnant, right? So those are the 6, right? Care, fairness, loyalty, authority, purity, and freedom, or liberty, right? So, anyway, this one here from Jane the Virgin, maybe you're familiar with the show, illustrates the importance of purity, right? Jane, in this video, the young woman here, gets offended very specifically because the doctor in the video offends her sense of purity. So, good example. I had you guys check out this brief one here, the religious orientation measure. It looks at 4 different religious orientations. I'm going to run through them kind of quickly. There's intrinsic religiosity. This is where you basically value your religion in and of itself, right? So if you're a Christian, right, you look very closely at the teachings of Jesus, and you're like, yes, those teachings are the core of my life. That's what I live by, right? Whereas extrinsic religiosity might be something that's kind of more about kind of the extra benefits you get from this. Not necessarily negative things. It could be things like, power or money, but it could also be things like community or kind of having counsel, like from, say you're a Jewish person, you like the counsel from your rabbi, or you like the sense of community you get from going to temple and worshiping with your fellow Jews. There is quest religiosity, which is essentially where you're kind of bouncing from faith to faith, looking for some kind of deep spiritual truth. The idea is that no one religion has all the answers, but that you're trying to get the truth from whatever source you can get it from, right? So maybe you're a Jewish person bouncing to Buddhism, and then you experiment with Hinduism for a little bit, and then maybe you're talking to your Christian friends, and you're like, well, maybe I'm going to convert. So it's loosey-goosey. Whereas fundamentalism, right, is something that's kind of the opposite of that, right? You could have, for example, a Buddhist fundamentalist. These actually exist. A Buddhist fundamentalist who believes that only Buddhism is right, everything else is wrong, and that I need to enforce this particular belief even by violence if necessary, right? You have this, unfortunately, in the country of Myanmar, also known as Burma, where there are some fundamentalist Buddhists who believe that they should not tolerate other religions in their country. They're unfortunately persecuting many of the Rohingya people who are largely Muslim in terms of religion. Example of fundamentalism, right? Anyway, the last part was some sections from this video here, religion, crash course sociology. It's a sociology video, not a psychology video, but because sociology has influenced social psychology, it's important. You only need to watch really until about 4 minutes and 45 seconds. That's 4 minutes and 45 seconds. If you want to watch the whole thing, go for it. But really, you only need to watch those 4 minutes and 45 seconds. Particularly looking for these 2 people that are in the video, right? Talking about 2 theorists about religion. Pay attention to those guys. And then there's the ticket out the door. The ticket out the door, just some multiple choice questions touching on all this stuff I covered. If you were paying attention, if you're following along with everything, you should be good. If you still need help, please, please, please